My brother treated me like his personal ATM, so I closed the account. The loan officer slid the rejection letter across her desk with the kind of practiced sympathy that told me she'd done this 1,000 times before. I'm sorry, Mr. Brennan. With your debt-to-income ratio and the outstanding judgments against you, we can't approve the mortgage. I stared at her, confused, because I'd checked my credit score 2 months earlier, and it was pristine. 782. Perfect payment history. Zero debt beyond my car loan. She rotated her computer monitor so I could see the screen, and that's when my world imploded. 17 accounts I'd never opened. Collections agencies I'd never heard of. A judgment for $38,000 on a personal loan I'd never taken. My hands went numb as I scrolled through the list, each line another knife in my back. The most recent account had been opened 3 weeks ago. Someone was still actively destroying my financial life, and I knew exactly who it was. My brother Keith had my social security number. He'd asked for it 6 months earlier to add me as an emergency contact on his apartment lease. I'd given it to him because that's what brothers do. That's what family does. Except Keith wasn't family. He was a parasite wearing my brother's face, and he'd been feeding on me for years. I'd been working as a civil engineer for Westfield Development for 8 years when Keith showed up at my apartment asking for help. This was maybe 2 years ago, back when I still answered his calls, back when I believed his promises about paying me back. He'd gotten fired from his warehouse job, he said, some misunderstanding with management that wasn't his fault. Never his fault. He needed $1,500 to cover rent, or he'd be evicted. I'd heard this story before, had lent him money 12 times since we were teenagers, but this felt different, more desperate. He looked thinner than I remembered, wearing clothes that hung loose on his frame. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he wasn't sleeping. I wrote him a check because he was my brother, because our parents had died in a car accident when I was 23 and he was 19, because we were all each other had left. He promised to pay me back by the end of the month. That was 732 days ago. I'd counted. The check cleared within hours. The payback never came. The pattern escalated slowly enough that I didn't recognize it as a pattern. A few weeks after the rent money, Keith called about a medical bill. $300 for an emergency room visit, he said, showing me a crumpled piece of paper with letterhead that looked legitimate enough. I sent the money via an app, watching the transaction process instantly. A month later, his car needed repairs. $500. Then his ex-girlfriend was threatening to sue him over property damage. $800. Then he needed money for a certification course that would help him get a better job. $1,200. Each request came with elaborate explanations, documentation that seemed real, promises that this would be the last time, that he'd gotten a job interview or a potential opportunity that would change everything. I wanted to believe him because believing meant we still had a relationship, meant I wasn't completely alone in the world. The truth, which I couldn't admit then, was that I was buying my brother's presence in my life, paying him to pretend we were family. Around month 4 of this cycle, I started noticing inconsistencies. Keith would mention details that contradicted earlier stories. He'd said the car repair was for transmission work, but later referenced getting new brakes. The medical bill was supposedly for a broken arm, but he never wore a cast. When I'd point out these discrepancies, he'd get defensive, accuse me of not trusting him, bring up how our parents would be disappointed in my suspicion. That guilt worked every time. Mom and Dad had drilled family loyalty into us our entire childhood. You take care of each other, they'd said. You're brothers. You're all you've got. So I swallowed my doubts and kept sending money, kept telling myself that eventually he'd stabilize, find steady work, become the person I remembered from our childhood. That person probably never existed. Memory is generous like that, editing out the ugly parts, creating nostalgia from selective footage. The real warning signs started when my credit card got declined at a restaurant. Nothing major, just dinner with colleagues after work, splitting the bill. My card reader came back with an error, insufficient funds, and I felt my face heat with embarrassment. I'd apologized, used a different card, played it off as a technical glitch. But that night, I logged into my bank account and found it nearly empty. $43 remaining from a balance that should have been around $4,000. The transaction history showed a withdrawal from an ATM across town, $200 at a time, 7 transactions over 3 days. I'd been working 60-hour weeks on a major project and hadn't checked my account in almost a week. Someone had drained it systematically, carefully, staying under the $500 limit that would have triggered fraud alerts. I knew immediately it was Keith. He was the only person who'd been to my apartment recently, the only one who could have seen where I kept my spare debit card in my desk drawer. I called him that night, hands shaking with anger and betrayal. He answered on the 4th ring, sounding groggy like I'd woken him up, even though it was only 9 p.m. I asked him directly if he'd taken money from my account. The silence stretched long enough that I knew the answer before he spoke. When he finally responded, the lies came fast and desperate. He'd needed emergency dental work, hadn't wanted to bother me after asking for so much already, planned to replace the money before I noticed, had a check coming from a settlement that would cover everything. The explanation was detailed and specific, delivered with exactly the right tone of shame and regret. It almost worked. Almost. But I'd heard too many of his stories by then. recognized the cadence of his deception. I told him he had 1 week to return the money or I was calling the police. He cried, actual tears, sobbing about how hard things had been, how he was trying so hard to get his life together, how much he appreciated me being the only person who still believed in him. That performance lasted 20 minutes. I fell for it completely. Keith never returned the money. Shocking. Instead, he stopped answering my calls for about 3 weeks, then showed up at my apartment with a sob story about his landlord changing the locks. He needed a place to stay, just for a few days, just until he sorted things out. I said no. First time I'd ever refused him anything directly. The look on his face shifted from desperate to cold in a way that scared me. He asked if I was really going to let my own brother sleep on the streets, if that's the kind of person I'd become. I held firm, told him he could stay one night, and he needed to figure something else out. He agreed, thanked me profusely, promised he'd be gone by morning. That night I locked my bedroom door for the first time in years. Didn't sleep much, kept hearing sounds from the living room, Keith moving around, opening cabinets, shifting furniture. In the morning, he was gone. So was my laptop, my iPad, and about $200 in cash I'd kept in my nightstand. I filed a police report that went nowhere. Officer Daniel Rourke, a weathered cop in his 50s who'd probably heard this story in 100 variations, told me that family theft cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute. Without video evidence or witnesses, it became he said, she said, and prosecutors rarely pursued charges. He suggested I change my locks and consider getting a restraining order. I did neither. Still wasn't ready to completely burn that bridge. The identity theft started subtly, or maybe it had been happening all along and I just hadn't noticed. I started getting calls from collection agencies about accounts I'd never opened. First, it was a cell phone contract with a company I'd never used. The representative, a patient woman named Carol Diaz, who worked for a recovery firm, explained that someone had opened an account in my name 8 months earlier, racked up $1,800 in charges, and never paid. I told her I hadn't opened the account, that it was fraud, that I'd file a dispute. She'd heard this before, spoke in the tired monotone of someone who dealt with deadbeats and liars all day. She said I'd need to file a police report and provide documentation proving I hadn't authorized the account. The process took weeks, required notarized statements and copies of my driver's license and utility bills. Eventually the debt got removed from my credit report, but the stress of fighting it, of proving my innocence for something I hadn't done, was exhausting. It never occurred to me this was just the beginning. More collection calls followed. A furniture store account with $3,000 in unpaid charges. A credit card I'd never applied for with a $5,000 balance. Each dispute required the same tedious process, the same documentation, the same presumption of my guilt until I could prove otherwise. My credit score, once my pride, began dropping. 780 became 750, became 720. Each fraudulent account left a scar even after I got it removed, because the inquiries remained, because the timeline of disputes created a pattern that looked suspicious. Lenders started seeing me as a risk, someone with chaotic finances, someone who couldn't be trusted. I knew Keith was behind it but couldn't prove anything definitively. When I confronted him during one of his rare appearances, asking if he'd opened accounts in my name, he acted wounded, said he couldn't believe I'd accuse him of something so serious, that he'd made mistakes, but would never stoop to identity theft. He suggested maybe someone had hacked my information, stolen my identity online, that I should be more careful with my personal data. The gaslighting was masterful. For a moment, I almost believed him. The mortgage rejection was my breaking point. I'd been saving for a house for 5 years, carefully managing my finances, building my credit, planning for a future that suddenly didn't exist. The loan officer, a kind woman named Barbara Frost, who'd been in residential lending for 20 years, suggested I hire a credit repair specialist and return in 6 months after cleaning up my report. 6 months. Half a year to fix damage I hadn't caused. I left her office in a daze, sat in my car in the parking lot, and finally admitted the truth I'd been avoiding. Keith was destroying me systematically, deliberately, without remorse. This wasn't a brother making mistakes or going through a rough patch. This was a predator, and I was his prey. The realization came with strange clarity, almost relief. Once you name the monster, you can start fighting it. I drove straight to a lawyer's office, walked in without an appointment, and asked to speak with someone about identity theft and fraud. The receptionist, seeing something in my face, made a call, and 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from attorney Thomas Garrett. Garrett was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with the sharp focus of someone who took his work seriously. He'd been practicing law for 11 years, specializing in white-collar crime and financial fraud. He listened to my story without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad in neat, precise handwriting. When I finished, he leaned back and studied me for a moment. "How much do you estimate he's stolen from you in total?" he asked. I'd done the math on the drive over, adding up every loan, every fraudulent account, every theft. Direct theft? Maybe $12,000 in cash and property. Fraudulent accounts? Approximately $38,000 that I know of. There might be more I haven't discovered yet. Garrett nodded slowly. "And you have proof he's behind this?" I didn't. Not really. Just circumstantial evidence, coincidences, gut knowledge that couldn't hold up in court. He saw my hesitation and smiled grimly. Then we start building a case. Document everything. Every suspicious transaction, every collection call, every interaction with your brother. Get a credit monitoring service, pull reports from all 3 bureaus, file disputes on everything fraudulent. Most importantly, file a police report specifically naming your brother as the suspected perpetrator. That creates an official record. I followed his instructions to the letter. Filed a comprehensive police report with Detective Lawrence Briggs, a veteran fraud investigator with the Financial Crimes Unit who'd been working these cases for 16 years. Briggs was skeptical at first, explaining that family fraud cases rarely resulted in prosecution, that proof was difficult, that victims often recanted when it came time to testify against relatives. I told him I wouldn't recant, that I wanted my brother held accountable, whatever that took. Something in my voice must have convinced him because he agreed to investigate. He gave me his direct number and told me to forward any evidence I collected. I signed up for comprehensive credit monitoring through 3 different services, each sending me alerts about any activity on my accounts. Within a week, I'd discovered 6 more fraudulent accounts I hadn't known about: a gas station credit card, a department store charge account, a personal loan from an online lender. Each one opened with my information, my social security number, addresses I'd lived at years ago. The pattern was clear. Keith had been doing this for at least 2 years, maybe longer, systematically opening accounts and ruining my credit while I'd been oblivious. The investigation moved slowly. Briggs requested records from every fraudulent account, comparing signatures on applications to my known handwriting. The signatures didn't match mine, but they were close enough that bank employees hadn't caught the fraud during the application process. He pulled security footage from a few stores where Keith had used the fraudulent cards, showing someone who looked like me but wasn't, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, deliberately obscuring his face. Keith was careful, or at least careful enough to create reasonable doubt. What he didn't count on was his own arrogance. He'd used his real phone number on several applications, probably figuring he could always claim he'd been helping me apply and had permission. That phone number linked everything together, created a digital trail that connected fraudulent accounts across multiple states. Briggs started pulling phone records, matching them to account openings, building a timeline that showed Keith's location coinciding with fraud activity. The case was developing, but slowly, too slowly. In the meantime, my life was falling apart. I got fired from Westfield Development 6 months into the investigation, not directly because of the fraud, but because of its consequences. A major client had run a background check as part of their vetting process for the project team, discovered the judgments and collection accounts associated with my name, and requested I be removed from the project. My boss, a pragmatic man named Leonard Voss, who'd always been fair with me, explained that he had no choice. The client was threatening to pull a multi-million-dollar contract unless I was replaced. He offered me the option to resign instead of being terminated, said it would look better on my record, asked if I was okay. I wasn't okay. I'd lost my home loan, my credit, and now my job because my brother was a thief. I resigned that afternoon, packed my office in a cardboard box, and walked out of a career I'd spent 8 years building. The humiliation was crushing, but worse was the helplessness. Keith was destroying me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it fast enough. Unemployment benefits barely covered my rent. I burned through my savings within 2 months, paying for lawyer fees, credit monitoring services, and basic living expenses. I took freelance drafting work when I could find it, but without a stable job, my income was sporadic and insufficient. I started selling possessions, my television, my sound system, furniture I'd bought years ago. Each sale felt like surrender, like I was slowly erasing my own life. I stopped seeing friends, stopped going out, stopped pretending everything was fine. Depression settled in like fog, heavy and immobilizing. My therapist, Dr. Angela Morrison. Wait, Morrison is a forbidden name. Let me use a different name. My therapist, Dr. Angela Reeves, who I'd started seeing on Garrett's recommendation, said I was experiencing complex trauma from ongoing victimization. She said that victims of family crime often struggled more than victims of stranger crime because the betrayal cut deeper, violated fundamental assumptions about safety and trust. She was right, but understanding why I felt destroyed didn't make the destruction any less real. Keith called me during this period, oblivious or uncaring about what he'd done. He needed money again, surprise, this time for a lawyer to fight charges related to a bar fight. His voice was casual, friendly even, like we were just brothers catching up. I'd been recording all our calls since starting the investigation, following Garrett's advice, and I let this one run. Asked him questions about his financial situation, about how he'd been managing money lately. He bragged about having more income than expected, said he'd been working the system, and figured out some creative solutions. I asked what that meant, and he laughed, said I wouldn't understand, it was complicated. Then he asked again for money, $2,000 this time. When I said I didn't have it, he got angry, started listing everything I'd done for him over the years, reframing my loans as obligations, suggesting I owed him continued support. The entitlement was breathtaking. He'd stolen my identity, destroyed my credit, cost me my job, and somehow believed I owed him more. I told him no, firmly, definitively. The call ended with him calling me selfish and hung up. I saved the recording, sent it to Briggs and Garrett. It wasn't a confession exactly, but it showed his mindset, his belief that my resources were his to exploit. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A forensic accountant named Christine Wu, brought in by Garrett to analyze the financial patterns, discovered that Keith hadn't been working alone. Several of the fraudulent accounts had co-signers or associated addresses that led to other people, what she called a fraud ring. Keith was part of a network that specialized in family identity theft, using stolen information from relatives to open accounts they'd then max out and abandon. The ring was sophisticated, organized, spread across multiple states. Keith wasn't just a troubled brother making bad decisions. He was an active participant in organized crime. Wu, who'd been working financial fraud cases for 12 years, said this was one of the more elaborate schemes she'd seen. The ring exploited the reluctance of families to prosecute their own members, banking on emotional manipulation and guilt to keep victims silent. I'd been the perfect target, alone, loyal, desperate to maintain the only family connection I had left. Wu's analysis provided the evidence Briggs needed to expand his investigation. He brought in the FBI, specifically Agent Nicole Strand from the White Collar Crime Division, who'd been tracking this particular fraud ring for 8 months. Strand was intense, focused, carrying the kind of authority that made you sit up straight when she entered a room. She'd been with the Bureau for 14 years, working financial crimes almost exclusively. She explained that Keith was a mid-level player in the organization, not the leader, but not merely a foot soldier either. He recruited family members and close friends as targets, using his natural charisma and sob stories to gain access to their personal information. The ring had victimized an estimated 70 people across 6 states, stealing approximately $2.3 million in total. My case wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern, and I was one of many victims who'd trusted the wrong person. Strand said they'd been building a RICO case, aiming to bring down the entire network, and my cooperation would be valuable. She asked if I was willing to testify, to face Keith in court, to endure the publicity and family judgment that would follow. I didn't hesitate. Said yes immediately. The arrest happened 3 weeks later. Coordinated raids across multiple cities, taking down 17 members of the fraud ring simultaneously. I wasn't present for Keith's arrest, but Briggs called me that afternoon with an update. Keith had been at his girlfriend's apartment, caught completely off guard, and had been charged with multiple counts of identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. His bail was set at $200,000, which he couldn't make. He'd be held in county jail pending trial. Briggs said Keith had asked about me during processing, wanted to know if I'd been the one to report him. When told yes, he'd apparently lost it, screaming about betrayal, about how I'd ruined his life. The irony was apparently lost on him. I felt nothing hearing this. Not satisfaction, not grief, just a hollow kind of numbness. The brother I'd known, or thought I'd known, was gone. Had been gone for years, probably. I'd just been too blind or too desperate to see it. The legal process ground forward with bureaucratic inevitability. Keith's public defender tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecution, armed with Wu's financial analysis and testimony from multiple victims, wasn't interested in being generous. They offered him a choice: plead guilty to all charges and accept a 12-year sentence, or go to trial and risk 25 years if convicted. His lawyer advised him to take the plea. Keith, demonstrating the arrogance that had gotten him caught, chose trial. He actually believed he could win, could convince a jury that he'd been framed or coerced, that he was a victim too somehow. His lawyer, a tired-looking woman named Rebecca Huang, who'd been a public defender for 9 years, looked like she wanted to quit during the preliminary hearings. She knew they had no case, that the evidence was overwhelming, but she had to mount a defense anyway. The trial lasted 2 weeks. I testified on the 4th day, walking the jury through my relationship with Keith, the loans, the thefts, the fraudulent accounts. Garrett had prepared me extensively, but nothing fully prepared me for sitting 15 feet from Keith while describing how he'd destroyed my life. He stared at me the entire time I was on the stand, his expression shifting between hurt and rage and something that might have been genuine confusion, like he couldn't understand why I was doing this to him. During cross-examination, his lawyer tried to paint me as a vindictive brother seeking revenge for family squabbles, suggested I'd given Keith permission to use my information, and then regretted it later. The prosecution objected repeatedly, the judge sustained most of them, and eventually the questioning ended. I stepped down from the stand feeling drained, used up, hollowed out. Garrett squeezed my shoulder as I passed him, a gesture of support that helped more than it probably should have. Other victims testified too. A woman whose cousin had stolen her identity to finance a drug habit. A man whose brother-in-law had opened credit cards in his name to fund a gambling addiction. An elderly woman whose grandson had taken out loans against her house. Each story was a variation on the same theme: family exploiting trust, using relationships as weapons, destroying lives without apparent remorse. The jury listened with visible discomfort, their faces reflecting the horror of realizing that the people closest to you could be the most dangerous. The prosecution built a meticulous case, walking through phone records, security footage, handwriting analysis, financial transactions. Wu testified as an expert witness, explaining the sophistication of the fraud ring, how they'd built infrastructure specifically to exploit family relationships. Agent Strand testified about the broader investigation, the scope of the criminal enterprise, the planning and coordination involved. By the end of the prosecution's case, Keith's guilt was undeniable. The defense tried, called character witnesses who described Keith as a good person who'd made mistakes, who'd struggled with addiction and deserved compassion. His girlfriend testified that he'd been trying to get his life together, that he'd talked about making amends, that he was fundamentally decent underneath his problems. His former employer from years ago said Keith had been a reliable worker before his life fell apart. None of it mattered. The evidence was too strong, too comprehensive, too damning. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, guilty on all counts. Keith's face went pale when the verdict was read, his lawyer putting a hand on his arm to steady him. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. Keith was remanded to custody immediately. As bailiffs led him away, he turned to look at me one last time. I couldn't read his expression. Didn't want to. That chapter was over. Sentencing day arrived with thunderstorms, rain hammering the courthouse windows as if nature itself was passing judgment. The courtroom was packed with victims, prosecutors, FBI agents, journalists covering the case. The judge, Honor Ruth Kilpatrick, who'd been on the bench for 23 years, listened to victim impact statements before pronouncing sentence. I'd written one, but couldn't bring myself to read it aloud. Garrett read it for me, his voice steady where mine would have broken. Described the job loss, the ruined credit, the psychological damage, the years it would take to rebuild. Described the betrayal of trusting someone who'd shared my childhood, who I'd thought was family. Described the loneliness of realizing I was truly alone in the world now, that the last connection to my parents and my past had been poisoned beyond recovery. Other victims read their statements, some crying, some angry, all damaged by Keith's choices and the choices of his co-conspirators. Judge Kilpatrick listened to everything before speaking. Her voice was measured, calm, carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many variations of human cruelty. She said this wasn't a case of desperate people making desperate choices. This was organized crime, calculated exploitation, predatory behavior that targeted the most vulnerable relationships humans have. She said family bonds are sacred, that betraying them for financial gain represented a particular kind of evil that warranted serious consequences. She sentenced Keith to 18 years in federal prison, longer than the prosecution had requested. He'd serve a minimum of 15 years before being eligible for parole. Restitution was set at $93,000, covering what he'd stolen from me and other victims. The chance of seeing that money was essentially zero, but having it officially recognized mattered somehow. The judge's final words stuck with me. You didn't just steal money, Mr. Brennan. You stole trust, safety, and family. Those are debts you can never repay. Keith appealed. The appeal was denied. He tried again with a different argument. Denied again. Eventually, he accepted that he'd spend the next decade and a half in prison, that his freedom was gone, that his choices had consequences after all. I heard about these appeals secondhand, through Garrett, who'd continued representing me through the recovery process. I'd asked him to handle everything so I wouldn't have to think about Keith anymore, wouldn't have to process updates or make decisions. I just wanted it over. Wanted Keith to fade into something that happened to me once, rather than something that defined me. That took time. More time than I expected. The trauma doesn't end when the trial ends. It lingers, reshapes you, changes how you move through the world. Rebuilding my credit took 3 years. 3 years of disputing accounts, filing paperwork, waiting for bureaucratic processes to grind through their cycles. Each fraudulent account had to be proven false, documented, removed individually. Even with Wu's forensic analysis and court records proving Keith's guilt, the credit system moved with deliberate slowness. Collection agencies had to be contacted separately, provided with documentation, convinced to remove negative marks. Some cooperated immediately. Others fought, requiring additional legal intervention from Garrett. My credit score recovered incrementally, painfully. 600 became 650, became 700. Each increase felt like reclaiming a piece of myself Keith had stolen. By year 3, I'd climbed back to 760. Not quite where I'd been, but functional, legitimate. A person who could apply for loans and get approved. I found new work eventually. A smaller firm, a lower position than I'd held before, but steady employment with decent pay. My new boss, a kind man named Richard Kaplan who ran a boutique engineering consultancy, knew about my background. I'd been honest during the interview, explaining the gap in my resume, the fraud case, everything. He'd listened carefully and said, "That wasn't your fault. You were a victim, not a criminal. If you're as good as your portfolio suggests, the job is yours." I'd nearly cried right there in his office. The validation, the simple acknowledgement that I hadn't deserved what happened, meant more than the salary. I started the following Monday, threw myself into work with the kind of focus born from having lost everything once and being determined never to lose it again. Kaplan commented on my dedication, said he wished more employees cared as much about quality. I didn't explain that work was safer than relationships, that professional achievement felt controllable in ways human connection never would again. Therapy continued. Doctor. Reeves said I was experiencing complex PTSD. That family betrayal created specific trauma patterns that required specialized treatment. We worked on rebuilding my ability to trust, identifying red flags in relationships, setting healthy boundaries. She said I'd been parentified after our parents died, forced into a caretaker role for Keith that had been inappropriate and harmful. Said I'd confused enabling with love, learned to measure my worth by how much I could give rather than how I was treated. The insights were painful, forcing me to examine my own role in the dynamic. I hadn't deserved Keith's theft, but I'd created conditions that made it possible. Had ignored warnings, rationalized red flags, prioritized reconciliation over accountability. Those were patterns I needed to change if I didn't want to repeat them. She assigned me homework. Practice saying no. Notice when I'm making excuses for people. Sit with the discomfort of conflict rather than immediately smoothing it over. Slowly, incrementally, I started changing. Dating was difficult. Explaining my past without scaring people away required delicate navigation. Some people heard identity theft by my brother and decided I carried too much baggage, that my family drama was a red flag. Fair enough. Others stayed, curious or compassionate or carrying their own trauma that made mine recognizable. I dated a woman named Laura for 8 months. She'd lost a sibling to addiction, understood family grief and betrayal in ways most people couldn't. We bonded over shared damage, which seemed romantic until we realized we were trauma bonding rather than actually connecting. We ended things amicably, staying friends, both acknowledging we needed more healing before committing to anyone. Dr. Reeves said that was growth, recognizing incompatibility and choosing honesty over convenience. I tried to see it that way. Mostly, I just felt lonely. The restitution payments started 2 years into Keith's sentence. $37 a month, deducted from his prison wages, sent to a victim compensation fund that distributed it among his victims proportionally. At that rate, he'd pay back maybe $3,000 total over his entire sentence. The math was depressing. I'd never see most of my money, never reclaim what he'd stolen. But the payments weren't really about money. They were about acknowledgement, about the system officially recognizing that harm had been done and attempting restitution, however inadequate. Each month when the payment notification arrived, I felt a complicated mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that Keith was being held accountable. Sadness that this was all that remained of our relationship. $37 a month, the monetary value of a destroyed brotherhood. I bought a house 4 years after the trial. Nothing fancy, a small 2-bedroom ranch on the outskirts of town, but it was mine. The mortgage approval felt like reclaiming territory Keith had stolen, proving I could rebuild what he'd destroyed. Closing day was emotional in ways I hadn't anticipated. Signing the papers, receiving the keys, walking through empty rooms that represented a future I'd thought was impossible. I called Garrett from the driveway, thanked him for everything he'd done. He brushed off the gratitude, said he was just doing his job, but I could hear the smile in his voice. Said I should be proud of myself, that recovery from this kind of betrayal was rare. Most victims never fully rebuilt. I'd beaten the odds. I sat in my car after the call, staring at my house, trying to feel the pride he'd mentioned. Mostly I felt tired. Tired but safe. That would have to be enough. Keith sent me a letter from prison about a year ago. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won. The letter was surprisingly lucid, free of the manipulation and excuses I'd expected. He apologized, said he understood I'd never forgive him, that he didn't deserve forgiveness. Said addiction and desperation had turned him into someone he didn't recognize, someone who'd hurt the only person who'd ever given a damn about him. Said he thought about our parents sometimes, wondered what they'd think of who he'd become. The letter ended with a simple statement. You deserved better. I'm sorry. I read it 3 times, waiting for the catch, the manipulation, the request for money or support. It never came. Just an apology. Too late, too insufficient, but maybe genuine. I didn't respond. Couldn't bring myself to open that door again, even to accept his remorse. I filed the letter away with all the other documents from the case, evidence of something that happened to someone I used to be. Dr. Reeves asked how I felt about the letter during our next session. I said I didn't know, which was honest. Part of me wanted to forgive him, release the anger that had become exhausting to carry. Part of me knew that forgiveness would feel like betraying myself, like saying what he'd done was okay when it categorically wasn't. She said I didn't have to choose, that I could hold both feelings simultaneously, could acknowledge his apology without absolving him, could recognize his humanity without reconciling. She said sometimes the healthy choice was simply moving forward, carrying the past, but not living in it. I liked that framing. Carrying, but not living in it. That felt achievable in a way forgiveness didn't. I reconnected with old friends gradually, people I'd lost touch with during the worst years, who'd reached out occasionally but whom I'd pushed away, explained what had happened, why I'd disappeared, how I was rebuilding. Most were understanding, some were shocked, all were supportive in their own ways. One friend, David Ling, who I'd known since college, said he'd suspected something was wrong but hadn't wanted to pry, said he wished he'd pushed harder, been more insistent about staying connected. I told him it wasn't his fault, that I'd needed to isolate to survive. He invited me to his daughter's birthday party the following month. I almost declined, defaulting to the solitude I'd grown comfortable with, but forced myself to accept. The party was chaos, screaming kids and tired parents and cake everywhere. I helped clean up afterward, washing dishes alongside other adults, participating in the mundane rituals of community. It felt normal in a way my life hadn't felt in years. David thanked me for coming as I left, said it meant a lot to have me back in his life. I realized on the drive home that I'd smiled more that afternoon than I had in months. Small progress nonetheless. Work continued steadily. Kaplan promoted me to senior engineer after 2 years, recognizing my contribution and reliability. The promotion came with significant raise, better benefits, and the kind of professional validation I'd thought I'd lost forever. I started taking on more complex projects, eventually leading teams, rebuilding the career Keith had destroyed. One client specifically requested me for a major development project, citing my attention to detail and problem-solving skills. That recommendation led to others, and slowly my reputation recovered. I'd never reached the level I'd been at before everything fell apart. Too much time had been lost, but I built something new, something that felt earned rather than merely achieved. There was satisfaction in that, knowing I'd clawed my way back through sheer persistence. 5 years after Keith's sentencing, I attended a victim support group that Wu had recommended. She said talking with others who'd experienced family fraud helped some people process the unique betrayal. The group met weekly in a community center, 8 to 12 people sharing stories and strategies. Their experiences mirrored mine in disturbing ways. Siblings stealing identities, parents taking out loans in children's names, spouses hiding debt. The common thread was betrayed trust, the specific pain of being destroyed by people who should have protected you. Everyone carried similar scars: hypervigilance about finances, difficulty forming close relationships, persistent anxiety about vulnerability. Sharing these experiences with people who understood without explanation was therapeutic in ways individual therapy couldn't quite achieve. I continued attending even after Wu suggested I'd graduated from needing it. The connections mattered more than the healing at that point. I ran into Keith's ex-girlfriend 2 years ago at a grocery store. Stephanie, who'd testified at his trial, looked different than I remembered. Healthier, more grounded. We made awkward small talk in the produce section before she asked if we could get coffee sometime. Said she'd wanted to apologize for enabling Keith's behavior, for not speaking up sooner when she'd suspected something was wrong. I agreed to meet, more curious than anything else. Over coffee, she explained that Keith had been using her too, stealing from her accounts, lying about employment, the same patterns he'd used on me. She'd left him shortly before his arrest, spent 2 years in therapy processing the relationship. She said she understood now that he was sick, that addiction and entitlement had turned him into someone incapable of genuine connection. We parted amicably, exchanged numbers with no real intention of staying in touch, but the conversation gave me perspective, reminded me that Keith's destruction hadn't been targeted. I wasn't special. I was just available. The 10-year anniversary of Keith's arrest passed quietly last month. A decade since my life imploded, since I lost everything and had to rebuild from nothing. I marked the occasion by reviewing my financial records, documenting the full recovery. Credit score, 791. Net worth, positive for the first time since the fraud began. Savings account, healthy and growing. I'd done it. Survived the worst thing that had ever happened to me and emerged functional, if not undamaged. That night, I took myself to dinner at an expensive restaurant, ordered wine and steak, sat alone and savored the meal, a private celebration of resilience, of refusing to stay broken. The waiter asked if I was celebrating something special. I said yes, but didn't elaborate. He smiled and brought me dessert on the house. I sat there eating tiramisu and watching other diners, families and couples and groups of friends, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, but contentment. Peace with where I'd ended up. Keith will be released eventually. Another 5 years if he makes parole, 8 if he doesn't. I've thought about what happens when he gets out, whether he'll try to contact me, whether I'll need to rebuild the walls I've slowly lowered. Garrett said I could get a restraining order if needed, that my cooperation during his prosecution would make approval straightforward. I haven't decided yet. Part of me wants that legal barrier, that official documentation that Keith stays away forever. Part of me thinks he's learned enough in prison that he wouldn't dare approach me. Either way, I'm prepared now in ways I wasn't before. I know what red flags look like, know how to protect myself, know that saying no isn't cruel, it's survival. Dr. Reeves says I should write an ending to this story, a conclusion that provides closure. But there isn't a neat ending. Keith's in prison. I've rebuilt my life. The damage remains, but no longer defines me. Some days are harder than others. I still check my credit report obsessively, still feel panic when bills arrive unexpected, still struggle to trust people who get too close. But I'm functional, working, living, building relationships slowly and carefully, letting people in one cautious degree at a time. That's not the Hollywood ending where everything's fixed and everyone's healed. It's just reality, the place where you survive the worst thing that ever happened and keep walking forward because stopping isn't an option. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.